Pleased to welcome you to the 2017 Zverina Lecture. This year we were fortunate that the event could go in tandem with another event that will be taking place tomorrow. It's the culmination of almost 3.5, 4 years of effort to produce a digital exhibit called How Medicine Became Modern. If you drive by your building, you'll see a big banner out there now alerting the public to this. The inception of this, the beginning of it, came when we got a letter from Jim Young, who's in the audience with us today, from the Lerner College of Medicine, and also from Pam Davis, to develop an interactive touchscreen display. They basically wanted a history of medicine component, but they did not want another museum in the new medical school building. And inspiration was derived from looking over at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where they saw Gallery 1, and they said, we want one of those of medical history, and that was the mandate. We were very fortunate to get funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities to bring that forward, as well as several local sources of funding. So it caused us to think a lot about what is the role of digital technology in the exhibits we create and use. And we asked Lisa O'Sullivan, who's hiding in the wings, she'll be out momentarily, to speak on these topics tonight. She, I think, is very well qualified by virtue not only of her background and experience, but also her current interests. Lisa is originally from Australia, and she finished her undergraduate training there and was advised by her advisor to go to England for graduate study, which she did, and she ended up getting a PhD in 2006 from Queen Mary University in the history of medicine, specifically looking at the French concept of nostalgia and medical concepts in the Napoleonic era. And at the same time that she was completing this, she was gaining experience all along the way in medical museums and related institutions. Even when she was an undergraduate in Australia, she worked for the Australian Sciences Archives Project, which was devoted to the preservation and communication of Australia's scientific, technical, and medical heritage. And then once she got to the UK, she, after a certain period of time, I believe she started in 2003 at the Science Museum in South Kensington, London, and her mandate there was twofold. One was to work with the collections in an administrative capacity, but also she was one of the people that led the development of a web-based platform called Brought to Life, in which the Science Museum would showcase its collections. So you could search the collections by date, by time, by country, by medium, and by instruments and so forth. So remotely you could explore their collections without actually going into their storage to see things that weren't normally on display. And subsequent to that, she ended up coming to the States, to the New York Academy of Medicine, and is currently director of the library and special collections there. And she continues to take an abiding interest in the use of digital technologies in that capacity. And she also shares what she learns with others in the capacity as she is the digital media and humanities editor of the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. And it carries periodic reviews of exhibits, of new initiatives to archive and preserve material digitally. And so we thought that she would be a really great person to look at the trends in this field as they pertain to what we've done and what may be on the horizon for others in grappling how to make the most effective and efficient use of this technology. And with that, I'll let Lisa take the mic.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening, everybody. And that was a very kind and generous introduction with one mistake. My supervisor told me I'd be a fool to go to Britain, and if I was at all serious about my discipline, I should be doing graduate studies in the States. So that's now on record that yes, he was probably right. So I've just started wearing these reading glasses, so if I appear to be kind of peering and frowning at you, my apologies for that. I'm delighted to be here this evening. I'd like to thank the Dittrich team for welcoming me, Jim, Jennifer, Brandy, and Laura in particular. And as I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience, Jim Edmondson is an incredibly engaged and generous member of the history of medicine and the medical museums community, both here and in the States. Sorry, now I've forgotten where I am. Both in the States and across the globe. I'm really grateful for the work that he's done to build and strengthen our community and the welcome he always shows to newcomers in the field. I'd also like to acknowledge the Zverina family, who have been part of the Cleveland community since Antonin and Christina Zverina immigrated from Bohemia in 1874. Have I got that correct? That would... My apology. The Anton and Rose Zverina lecture, endowed in 1978, and the Family Foundation has an ongoing connection to the district, including the renovation of the Zverina room holding the district's libraries and other materials in 2001. I know well both how important institutions like the district are to their local communities, and also how critical the support of committed donors is to such institutions. So I'm really honoured to be here tonight joining a very distinguished set of speakers in celebrating that legacy. So as I've been developing this presentation, the shorthand nickname I've been coming back to is Digital Dreams, Digital Nightmares. With very few exceptions, most medical museums have evolved from collections that were designed for medical professionals into spaces and places that seek to share their collections with public audiences. New approaches to the material culture of medicine has been critical to this shift, as has engaging with the possibilities created by digital technologies. So this evening, I want to talk you through some of the current digital initiatives and trends in medical museums. There's a lot of exciting content to share. However, there are also many challenges to effectively and sustainably using these technologies, and some of them I think are particularly acute for medical museums, whether trying to use them for visitors in the galleries or encountering the collections online. So if not nightmares, there are definitely some stories of what went wrong that I'd like to share. And I'm going to start by touching on some general issues that have been created by the embrace of digital technologies, as well as issues more specific to medical museums and museums of the history of medicine. So first of all, I'd like to broadly define what I'm talking about under the banner of digital, with this understanding that it's in no way comprehensive. Digital technologies are varied. What counts as a digital tool in the context of a museum, a library, or other cultural institution can be broad, from interactives on galleries, content accessed through electronic devices, online games, online content and applications, blogs, Twitter, Instagram, the list could go on. Social media accounts have become almost de rigueur for museums, although as we'll see, medical museums have engaged with social media and the digital sphere more generally in different ways, and I think with different levels of success. So one of my particular interests is how digital technologies are being used to engage more visitors more with physical objects. And, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't meant to happen. I was gesturing too much. And how they're trying to take collections outside the museum walls. So we'll be looking at a whole set of examples from multimedia displays, audio guides, films, interactive. Again, the list could go on. Current museological thinking really emphasizes the importance of storytelling, of engaging visitors in a narrative, taking them on a journey and leaving them wanting to explore more. However, the reality of how medical museums, and museums I think in general, have engaged with digital technologies has been far more fragmented, and you'll see some of that reflected in my talk this evening. I think that in particular there are many reasons that the uptake of digital technologies has been haphazard and patchy for medical museums. First and foremost, a sophisticated digital resource takes specialized skills and often significant investment. I think it's fair to say that there's an expectation amongst the museum community and museum audiences that the museums will be looking for ways to digitize their collections or to provide a digital component to their exhibitions and displays. In the past, that's sometimes taken on a bit of what I would call the quality of digitize it, and they will come, without necessarily any deep engagement with exactly what audiences are being targeted and exactly what those audiences are being offered. The early promise of let's digitize everything, for instance, saw projects like the Google Books attempt, which was started off with, we're digitizing all of the books in the world. An enterprise that very quickly came up against the realities of copyright infringements, authors' rights, and a stream of lawsuits. Now they have over 30 million books scanned, but when you look at the Google resource, you realize that many of those, due to all those issues, are only available in snippet views. And this reality is reflected in the project's new name, which is the Google Books Library Project, an enhanced card catalogue of the world's books, which really doesn't have the same impact. So recently, Tristan Hunt, who is the new director of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, caused a mini scandal in my world when he was reported by The Times to have suggested that museum goers visit exhibitions precisely in order to get away from the digital world. And instead, what they really want to do is have an encounter with material culture that's not mediated by technology. So this is the headline. And away from these newspaper headlines, he actually, unsurprisingly, had some far more nuanced thoughts, saying that an initial exuberance about getting everything out there as quickly as possible had created a scenario of sticking all this stuff out there for free with variable quality. And he was particularly discussing a disappointing take-up rate for some digital on-site tools, such as audio guides. His position on digitisation, because he was, of course, forced to make a public statement about this, was that the Victoria and Albert, most of whose collections are in fact digitised, were very passionate about it. We're strong on it, he said. But he felt there needed to be more analysis to ensure that they were actually being produced thoughtfully and that audiences also had the tools to utilise them. So while this is not specifically about medical museums, I think it's pretty much spot on, in that the enthusiasm for digital led many museums to push for digital projects and tools without a lot of critical analysis of the goals and the audiences. And I think there's a secondary but also important lesson about how this story played out. First, there was the flare-up. Lots of people commentating on Twitter, blogs, other forms of social media, being picked up by other newspapers, and then someone actually returned to Hunt's original comments, which, thanks to digital technologies, had been recorded and were available on a podcast. And it was only when you could listen to the podcast that you realised what he was actually saying. So this kind of reactive and rapid response offered by social media can offer incredible opportunities for museums to reach and engage with new audiences, but they can also go haywire fairly quickly. So some of you may or may not be aware that September 13 is the official Twitter Ask a Curator Day. So institutions worldwide are encouraged to send questions to the curators, and this produced this year a rather glorious, and I sometimes suspect in the dark of night staged, Twitter war between neighbouring institutions in London, the London Science Museum and the Natural History Museum. So it began with an apparently innocent question saying, who would win a staff battle between the Science Museum and NHM London? Which exhibits items would help you be victorious? Which is a rather fabulous question. And of course, the Natural History Museum decided to shut that down immediately. We have dinosaurs. No contest. To which the Science Museum said, they have old fossils. We have robots, Spitfires, the planes, and ancient poisons. Boom. If you have any interest at all in museums, you've got to look this up. It went on all day. We quickly moved to vampire fish, faked Victorian mermen, meteorites, cockroaches that survive the meteorites, Wellington boots that kill the cockroaches. This goes on forever. I mean, it's just, and it was incredible in terms of the range of collections that were brought to the public's attention. And I also think the tone in which it was done, because social media often has a very different tone, and I think this was very cleverly nuanced in a way that can be difficult for large, venerable institutions. However, while the Science Museum and Natural History Museum were basking in all the positive press and publicity, the British Museum, speaking of venerable institutions, had a slightly different experience. They were busy retracting, apologising, and writing statements in response to this tweet. Sometimes Asian names can be confusing, so we have to be careful about using too many. I am sure that I am not the only curator who winced when I read that. Justifiably, the tweet caused much offence. However, once again, context is key, this is the keeper of the Asian galleries who is trying to explain that the challenge of writing labels that are accessible and accurate when you're only allowed a very, very limited word count is super challenging. And if you're dealing with a statue of an Asian deity that has different names in different traditions, it's quite a political decision which one you choose. But of course, I think what the curator forgot in this context is that she was speaking to a global audience, one that didn't necessarily was going to see the rest of her argument. And so this one very, very unfortunately worded section of her argument overtook the entire situation. So I mention these case studies because while I fully believe in the potential of digital and especially social media to help institutions with public engagement, I also urge a lot of caution. Thinking through the implications of who both the intended and unintended audiences for your content might be is critical when you move into this very decontextualized environment. And again, within this exciting but sometimes challenging sphere, I think there are particular challenges and opportunities for medical museums and medical libraries as well. Some of these actually arise from the history of medical museums themselves. As again, many of this audience will know, most large-scale medical collections were created not with history in mind, but as part of mostly 19th century attempts to connect disease symptoms during life with pathological lesions after death. So these museum collections are primarily found in medical schools and understood as an educational space intended for use by researchers, students, and very occasionally, very highly selected members of the public. Here, specimens and objects gain meaning in relationship to each other in a system that goes from the normal to the abnormal, diseased, and healthy. As Erin McCleary describes in her doctoral dissertation on the history of medical museums in the United States, these spaces were understood as intellectually analogous to a laboratory. They were sites of knowledge production and transmission. They were believed to be particularly pedagogically compelling because they helped students learn to make a link between their abstract medical knowledge and the physical realities they would face in practice. Specimens made the abstract concrete. Their three-dimensionality was believed to create a unique sensory experience that could not be matched by any other educational approaches. This model of object-based learning was so prevalent that in his famous 1910 report on the state of North American medical training, Abraham Flexner stated that the conclusive evidence of lack of educational conscience of pride is the general absence of a decent museum. However, in the first half of the 20th century, this model of material culture-based learning and teaching declined, with the uncertainty about the role of specimens in visualizing and communicating medical knowledge. And you know, it's not often that I say go read someone's doctoral dissertation, but Erin McCleary's doctoral dissertation about why the United States relatively now has so few medical museums is fabulous. She's now at the Chemical Heritage Foundation. So why am I telling you now in the context of this lecture tonight? I think it's both in terms of the original, for many museums, emphasis on the critical importance of the real and the tangible, but also in terms of the audiences for whom they were created. They were not created for the public in almost all cases. Of course, with shifts in medical education away from gross anatomy, there was another reason that many collections were discarded or dispersed. Of those that were retained, some were reinterpreted as historical collections, and some were reorientated to public audiences. However, their intrinsic value was no longer taken for granted. Now, I think, medical museums often struggle with the perception that they're full of materials that might, dare I say it, be dull, might be confronting, or impenetrable to non-specialist audiences, making the demand for curatorial interpretation that little bit much higher. The district, of course, is very different, and to my mind fortunate, because it was founded with history in mind. When the Historical Committee of the Cleveland Medical Library was formed in 1898, its focus was particularly on the material legacy of medical practice, particularly tracking how the instruments and technologies of medicine have changed over time, and hence changed the experience for medicine and patients and practitioners alike. And I think that legacy really informs the success of making medicine modern that we'll be seeing later. Excuse me, I'm at the end of a throat infection, so rather than cough, I'll just stop and take some water. So given that background, I'm now going to share a few case studies that illustrate some different models of digital engagement amongst medical museums today. It's arguably a challenging time for medical museums, as it is for many other specialist museums, in that there are core questions about what is this collection for? Which audiences should we serve? Which was not a question that necessarily needed to be asked in the past. Okay, who do we want to attract? What is going to interest them, and what are they going to have learned when they leave? And there have been a plethora of responses to this challenge. Most have involved some level of digital engagement. And again, I should say, for those that haven't, it's not necessarily a case of disinterest. It's often lack of resources. Because as we'll see, digital products are labour-intensive, resource-hungry, and not always very sustainable. Having said that, we will start with the one medical museum that is not financially limited in any way. For many of you may know the story of Henry Wellcome, born in Wisconsin in 1853. He became a hugely successful pharmaceutical entrepreneur. At his death in 1936, he was a naturalised British citizen, a billionaire, who left his considerable fortune to create a trust for biomedical research, and crucially for us, to support the history of medicine and the care of his collection. At the time of his death, the Wellcome collection numbered over 1 million objects, which reflected Wellcome's broad understanding of medicine as anything humans had used to protect themselves from harm. So the collection not only includes medical instruments and technologies, it's got archaeological material, anthropological material, religious objects, materia medica. It's a crazy collection. I say that as someone who has curated the final core of about 100,000 that is still kept at the Science Museum. We were encouraged to refer to Henry Wellcome as eccentric. Others have used the words such as obsessive. I mean, literally crates and crates and crates of objects, some of which have still not been opened in other places. That's a fascinating story, both Wellcome and the history of his collections, but it's too long to tell now. My point is that the Trust is now a major funder of biomedical research, while the Wellcome collection acts as an umbrella for its cultural activities and outputs. Though, as I mentioned, the objects live at the Science Museum in London, and the 2D materials live in the library at the Wellcome Trust. And as you can probably imagine, many were the fights when things would randomly turn up, and we would have big fights. Are these 2D or 3D? Who gets them? So the Wellcome has invested heavily in digitising its image and library collections, and you can find them online under a Creative Commons license, which means that there's free use of otherwise copyrighted material as long as you attribute the trust. And I think that's another interesting kind of side note, in that places like the Trust and the Getty have really embraced this model of providing free content, whereas for many smaller institutions, the promise of digitisation was partly about a new revenue stream, which has been quite challenging. The Wellcome is very experimental and has lots of different cultural products. So for instance, this is their reading room at the Euston Road in London headquarters, which is a hybrid museum, library, event space that is actually deliberately, I think, non-digital. They do use the digital in some interesting ways. So this, for instance, is Foreign Bodies, Common Ground. And 6 artists were commissioned by the Wellcome to take residencies at medical research centres in Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, Thailand, Vietnam, and the UK. And on the web, you can actually bring together all of those artists' work and see them in juxtaposition to each other, which is wonderful. And I should say that at the New York Academy of Medicine, where I currently run the historical library, as Jim mentioned, we're working with our neighbours at the Museum of the City of New York as the New York hub of a new Wellcome project called Contagious Cities. So they've upped the ante a little bit, and along with hubs in Geneva and Hong Kong, we have the Wellcome is commissioning exhibitions, walking tours, films, and new art, each of which will be specific to the site in which it is produced, but there will be a digital presence in which the curators and producers and artists involved at each site will be expected to engage with each other and actually explore how those situations of three very different port cities and their relationship with infectious disease plays out. That's in the very early stages, so I don't know how that's going to work either. There are also, of course, medical museums who rely almost purely on digital engagement, and I call these the science centre model. These are museums that have very little material culture or object collections. They tend to be focused on education and learning rather than history. And I'm just very quickly going through this example from the Cité des Sciences in Paris. This is their permanent brain exhibition, and there's just a few kind of key points about like how is a big institution using this approach. So this really is a guide to the physical space. It's got practical information, where do you buy your tickets, what can teachers bring for classes, downloadable audio. It's not interactive particularly, it's an overview. And then, you've got pictures of the gallery that don't really give you a virtual tour, but they tell you this is the kind of thing you might encounter. And then we get to the audio guide, and you may notice I've moved to English for this slide. And what I find interesting about it is there's quite a few different instructions. If this doesn't work, scan this code, easy. If that doesn't work, try something else. And when that doesn't work, here's your other option, which suggests to me that there are probably some significant issues with accessing this probably wonderful audio guide, especially if you're a foreigner who doesn't have, mobile access in France. And I would also say it's interesting that, the audio guide is available in English, Italian, and Spanish. Many of the other resources are Francophone only. So that, again, takes me back to this point that the digital community is a global one. Museums need to make choices about how they deal with that reality. Here, my sense is that the reality that the Cité is engaging with is they've done a lot of analysis of their physical visitors and the languages they speak. So this is, again, really, it's online, but it's designed for physical visitors. Because, of course, as soon as you get to the teaching resources, it's back into French. Many museums also use the digital realm as an opportunity to go further. In a more cynical vein, a friend of mine who's a digital developer describes it as dumping all the extra content the curators didn't want to lose on my beautiful website. I don't want to suggest that's the case here, obviously, but I think it's worth noting that there is this ongoing conversation in the museum community about how many visitors actually do go home from a gallery and then look it up on the web and do engage. That's the aspiration. I think it's still an open question of how much it's happening. And then there is also some extra kind of content online connected to this exhibition which does engage with history. This is the only place I found that they do. It's based on the library collections. Again, how have the brain and mind been understood over time in the old books of the library? Again, we're monolingual. There's not very much interpretation, even in French. So you can pop up an image and you can have a look at it and you can know where it's from. So someone's shaking their head. It's like, I don't know who the audience for this is either. But it is one of the kind of remnants that you see of, I think, earlier attempts to get collections online. This is a much more focused, very small in Berlin, the Otterbock Science Center. This is what I would describe almost as a lobby museum, that it's actually the public engagement front of a company, which is heavily invested in creating equipment for Paralympics. And I find it very interesting because I think they do a really nice job here of having a purely, as far as I can tell, I've not visited, digital resources, but all of them involve some kind of physical engagement with those digital resources in order to make them work. So it's very mission driven, and I think the spirit of a company that makes adaptive technologies really comes through. But my focus tonight is obviously mostly on historical museums of medicine, so we're moving from Berlin to Edinburgh, where the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, which you see here, recently won the Museums and Heritage Award for Excellence in 2006 as the best permanent exhibition anywhere in the United Kingdom. I feel compelled to mention here that the press release describes this award as the Oscars of the heritage industry, so it's big. What I find really lovely about this museum experience online is that it uses the digitally simply but effectively to give you a sense of the physical experience. And as someone who gets very frustrated with virtual tours, I actually found this one compelling, particularly what I think must be the piece de resistance of the exhibition, which is a virtual dissection theatre. So here, visitors can watch a body's interior be revealed, while having audio commentary from the video monitor set up on that ceiling, presumably by one of the hunters, and from that little snapshot, I think probably William Hunter. So it's a great example of actually using digital specifically to enhance the experience of visitors to a physical space and to give meaning and context to a historical collection of physical objects. And of course, the other way, in the other direction, has been to use digital technologies to take the collections and content out to virtual audiences. And I say collections and/or content because, going back to the Tristram Hunt mini scandal, there are a lot of websites which act as virtual catalogues of physical collections, and they are incredibly useful for scholars and for anyone looking for particular information about a specific artifact. But without a lot of interpretation, I think their audience is limited. So as Jim mentioned, I gave 2 years of my life to this project. And it was a project funded by the Wellcome Trust for the Science Museum to digitise 4,000 objects, mostly from the Wellcome collection, which we held, and interpret them for web-based audiences. Hence the Brought to Life title. The idea was that we would bring the collections and the technologies to life. And I think there was an interesting tension built into the project from the start. The Wellcome Collections tagline is that they're providing content for the incurably curious. And they really tend to focus on quite a sophisticated adult audience, whereas the Science Museum is very much about education. And so for this project, what the museum was looking for was content that could be used by teachers. And I should also say that in the UK, there is an high school elective called Medicine Through Time. So high school students learn history of medicine. It's actually the most popular elective, or it's a very different world. So part of the goal was to integrate different materials and modes of engagement all at once. We were very optimistic. So there were books, artifacts, stories, interactives to give you this rich and meaningful experience. So here on one page you see the famous frontispiece from Vesalius's Fabrica, the fabric of the human body, together with an interactive that shows different historical understandings of blood circulation through time. And again, kind of a side note, in the very, very upper left, you'll see a text-only link. And one of the aspects of using the digital world, I think, is that there are profound implications for increasing or limiting accessibility for different audiences. The text-only site means that it can be read by an auto-reader for someone who has a sight impairment and can't actually read a website themselves. So all of the videos and interactives on this website were subtitled. Selected objects were also interpreted using British Sign Language. I don't have time to go into that at all. You're welcome to ask questions about it. But I just really wanted to highlight, I think it's very important, that digital technologies can create extremely inclusive content, or unwittingly, they can bar audiences from any interaction whatsoever with their materials. So you'll note that content was organised in themes with interrelated objects, timelines, and techniques and technologies. We were especially excited by techniques and technologies as an idea, which we interpreted very broadly. So for instance, laboratory mice had an entry here as a technology that has been critical to the advancement of medicine. We wanted to give a sense of the experience of people in very different times, places, and cultures, grappling with how to understand and treat illness and disease, but also what it meant to be well. And you'll see the inclusion of astrology there, which both reflects the breadth of the Wellcome collection, and as the person in charge of the global collections at the Science Museum, it also involved a lot of saying to people, inclusion does not mean endorsement. So like the Dietrich, we wanted to embed the technologies of medicine in human experience. Here in our treatments and cures theme, we chose to highlight the iron lung. Firstly, an iron lung that is within the collection that has a particular history and story. Secondly, with an interactive that explained why it was necessary to, particularly knowing that one of the audiences was school children who may not have any sense of the impact of polio in the past, but also demonstrate how that one worked, and hear from patients who had spent time in one, of which there are still, of course, people around. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you this interactive in action. I've been deliberately low-tech tonight, mostly because I've seen how attempts to integrate different technologies into presentations can go horribly wrong, which is why you're seeing my screen grabs. But in this case, I actually can't show you this interactive or any of the others. While we thought we were being pretty cutting edge at the time, which is, we started this about a decade and a half ago. Yep, that's about right. The infrastructure on which these were built are no longer supported by any modern web browsers. So the shelf life of this project, as it was meant to be, was more or less a decade, which is pretty shocking given the investment that went in. I don't completely despair because digital assets, luckily, can often be recycled or reused. So the images of the 4,000 digitized objects that I mentioned were taken from brought to life and reintegrated into this, I'm happy to say, much more robust collection site for the Science Museum and its partner museums. Of course, this site goes beyond the medical collections into all of the other groups. And another side issue that I find fascinating, but we don't have time for in detail, is what you might call discoverability. How does your audience know what's out there and how to find it? So I did a very simple search here on this site using medicine as a keyword, which turned objects tagged as therapeutics, which was not what I was expecting. And then for those, again, with good eyesight, the first object that pops up, remember, I've searched the global collections of the Science Museum Group, massive collections for medicine, and the first thing I get is an early vibrator. And the second I get is a quack electromagnetic machine. I will say we had lots of both. I will also say it's not what I was expecting to turn up in a national collection of medicine. While digital sites are becoming more sustainable and robust, another huge advantage for those lucky people working with digital approaches today is that they don't need to retrofit content into their exhibition strategies, which was the reality for quite a long time. But they can now integrate them from the earlier stages of a project. So the Science Museum is currently redoing its suite of 3 medical galleries. Some of you may remember hearing the rather wonderful Natasha McEnroe speak here at the Dietrich a few years ago. She is now the keeper of medicine at the Science Museum and leading a team of curators in developing the new gallery. So she kindly shared the top-level digital strategy for these galleries, which has been incorporated in the content development from the word go. And museum people will know why this is exciting. So you can immediately see there's a whole, and this is the top level summary. There's a whole range of techniques that will be integrated, from large-scale multimedia exhibits, which will provide narratives for kind of theatrical displays, whether it's an operating theatre or a pharmacy, animated objects, which will show how they work, their interior mechanisms, the sounds that they produce, to give a sense of how this material object operated and felt to operate. Extra information through digital labels, films. It's all about placing these objects in terms of the people and the societies that they impact, and foregrounding the experience of patients and practitioners. And to me, that's fundamentally key to interpreting this kind of material. So in other words, I think Natasha and her team have a great comprehensive plan that will make, and again, they've built in a lot of efforts to try and make sure that this is going to tip the content in an inclusive way rather than an exclusion way. Equally importantly, they've also split off the approaches that they will use beyond the gallery. So there's a real sense that the strategies and approaches you need to go beyond the gallery are quite different. Now, I was allowed by Jim to talk about one of my particular areas of interest this evening. I spent a lot of time in Britain working around with anatomical collections and issues of repatriation. So one of my themes this evening is the ways in which images of material objects can have multiple and multiplying lives in the digital sphere, in which they become completely unmoored from their original context. This can raise all kinds of questions about authority, authenticity, and accuracy. And it can also be the catalyst for some fundamentally clashing assumptions about sensitive objects. So my particular interest in anatomical specimens is both because they're at the core of so many historical medical museum collections, and because while I was Senior Curator of Medicine at the Science Museum, I was responsible for the care and display of human remains at the time when Britain was in complete upheaval, not all of Britain, the British museums, in terms of legislative frameworks and professional guidelines for human remains. The 2003 Human Tissue Act was passed into law in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. For complicated reasons, Scotland got away with their own. Informed consent was completely central to this act, which dealt with the use of the human tissue and the human body in a variety of mostly clinical and research settings. So it replaces the Anatomy Act of 1988, and was very much in response to a scandal centred on the Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool, where in 1999 it emerged that remains, often those of children and babies, had been systematically retained without consent or the knowledge of their parents. So it was a huge medical ethical scandal, and it became obvious that there was a need for a new Anatomy Act. However, the Act also includes human remains less than 100 years being stored or displayed by museums. And the inclusion of historical materials in an Anatomy Act is kind of unusual. And as far as I've been able to unearth, it's directly related to the fact that one of the very early iterations of Gunther von Hagen's body worlds with the plastinated bodies was on display in London at exactly the time the Act was being debated in the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament, because it was directly referenced by members of the House. It was a controversial exhibition, and there were a lot of members who just wanted to shut it down. And at the same time, or almost completely overlapping, there was a political statement by the Australian and British Prime Ministers, this was in 2000, committing both governments to increasing their efforts in the repatriation of Indigenous Australian materials. And in 2005, a separate guidance to human remains in museums was published, and that really stressed the need to consider the multiple and potentially competing notions of value that are attached to anatomical collections, and address questions of what could be considered ethical display. That guidance had no 100-year mark cut off, so there was a lot going on. But the key issue that I wanted to highlight for this evening is that despite some really early attempts to include them, images were specifically excluded from the Human Tissue Act. And the guidance really said nothing much about them at all, except, well, be sensitive about how you use them. So there's a scenario in which the retention and display of any anatomical material, any human tissue, is highly regulated and controlled. There's a framework that stresses ethics, respect, sensitivity. But you take a picture of that, and you can do whatever you like with it. So, Body Worlds eventually got a license to show in Britain, but you could take the most horrendously shocking and confronting images and have a photography exhibition with no problem at all, but you would be slapped with a massive fine should you actually choose to include anything real. So there's lots and lots of different processes of legislation and debates and discussions in lots of different national contexts. I won't go into those in detail, except to say that an important driver to many of these conversations has been Indigenous groups and source communities who are trying to re-establish their connections to remains, and many national governments getting involved in this. A really good example, and very recent, of this thing of how the web acts as a global site in which very different international sensitivities can play out. This is a story from the Guardian newspaper, September 25 this year, expressing dismay that the skull of an Australian World War I veteran was part of a, quote, grisly collection of sometimes freakish exhibits. So the article raised concerns both about the retention of the skull in an American museum. It's at the Mortar Museum at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Why was this Australian soldier's skull there? And also its interpretation as part of an online exhibition, which the journalist, I think not unsurprisingly, found a little bit disrespectful and trivialising. I think particularly the ouch. So the Mortar Museum's tagline is, "Are you ready to be disturbingly informed?" It sets up an audience expectation of education, but also confrontation and challenge. You know, the idea is not you are going to see these collections and feel awe and empathy. You're going to be disturbed, but you're kind of going to enjoy it and you're going to learn something. So its tone is often a little bit arch, which clearly works really well for its local audience because the Mortar has become a highly successful tourist spot in Philadelphia with over 100,000 visitors annually. But clearly it didn't work so much on the global sphere, and again, the Australian government would never have known that this skull was being held at the Mortar if they hadn't put it on an online discussion. This is October 4, so all of about 9 days later, the skull is being returned. The Australian government and the Australian Army had contacted the Mortar, who had assured them that they had the utmost respect for all human remains and that they would give the skull back immediately. And I'll say, I mean, that's just purely by chance that it's an Australian example, except that the Australian government has played a very particular role in repatriation that you don't necessarily see in other contexts. Now, the Mortar, to me, is a really interesting example. It doesn't allow photography in its galleries. But immediately outside the gallery is this image of one of the skeletons with giantism, to which they encourage visitors to take and share selfies. Tag your photograph Mortar giant, which the visitors do. You can find hundreds and hundreds of people taking a selfie with the giant. And I wouldn't normally share images of people I don't know on a presentation, but these are public. So let's move to social media. And it's social media, particularly things like Instagram and Twitter, which can be very visually focused, where I think material from medical museums can be used in a completely decontextualized and sometimes recontextualized way that many curators would never have dreamt of. So this grid is just a montage of Instagram feeds, and it's visitors to the Mortar Museum sneaking pictures where they can. It's an independent medical historian, it's a medical museum, and an antiques dealer. I find it quite confronting in that it's this barrage of images in which the selection clearly makes sense to the personal narrative that the creator is trying to tell, but there's often no acknowledgement or identification of where it came from, what it is. And I mean, part of that is probably me being a medical curator, feeling that my authority has been slightly challenged. But at the same, not necessarily a bad thing. But once an image is circulating on the web, it can be circulated multiple times, put in different situations, and there's no way to take that back. And I'm not wanting at all to suggest that medical museums shouldn't engage in digital products or social media outreach. I think they can be incredibly useful and powerful tools. But it needs to be undertaken thoughtfully and with the understanding that it may be difficult, if not impossible, to actually predict who's going to engage with your collections and your content, and what are they going to do with it. While online collections and exhibitions are normally now created with an audience or audiences specifically in mind, it's not possible to control who chooses to be the audience of that display and how they're going to interpret and understand your material. And, you know, again, human remains, I think, is where all of those issues come to a real point of contestation and difficulty. So finally, in conclusion, because I can talk a lot about human remains and you probably don't want to hear my thoughts on them all night, fascinating though they are, what works? You know, what are our takeaways and how do we think about using digital tools in that thoughtful way I was talking about? I think first and foremost, digitization and digital interpret are wonderful tools, but they don't in themselves necessarily provide museum goers, whether physical or virtual, with a meaningful experience unless they're very carefully contextualized and curated. Medical museums, as I mentioned earlier, were often based on anatomical collections formed with the belief that you can read knowledge directly from them. Now, most historical medical museums are specifically trying to tell stories and interpret artifacts for far broader and more diverse audiences. And I think it's sometimes we struggle because our audiences feel that this might be confronting, they might need rarefied information or knowledge to interpret them, and it's difficult to understand. So that's the job of as I said, I think the bar is sometimes higher for medical museums to really make things accessible and engaging without actually undermining the purpose of what we're trying to do with them. But I think when it works, it's a fabulous thing. And this is the Dittrich's How Medicine Became Modern, which I saw today and absolutely loved. And this is the brought to life concept that we tried all those years ago. You know, it gives you an opportunity to, and here's their interpretation of an iron lung, which works far better than ours ever did. It lets you get inside the object. I think that's particularly important because when you think about it, particularly late 20th century medical technologies are so computer-based that they're literally grey boxes. And actually making that visually interesting, let alone interesting in terms of understanding how it works, can be a challenge. And it also can show you the patient experience. What was it actually like to be in an iron lung? How was that? How did you cope with this situation? And I think this exhibition also really cleverly answers one of the biggest challenges to me of taking something from 3 dimensions into 2, which is the digital representation. I'm a terrible photographer, my apologies. The digital representation of an object loses its sense of dimensionality, and with it loses a sense of its size, its textures, sometimes its smells, its weight, all of which I think are part of the experience of awe and emotion that can be evoked by engaging directly with an object. But what I love about this is you see the object and then you see it next to a penny. And you realize just how tiny it is, which really, I think, emphasizes the skill that was needed to use it and makes it as an object much more meaningful. So these are only a few examples from this really wonderful and rich exhibition that I think also is very clever in, first of all, explaining on the left how you interact with this. I think there's an assumption often that people will just intuitively know how to use the digital technology, which is very often not the case, but also links the digital representations back to the objects on gallery. So I'm going to close with a quote from the Dietrich's own Brandy Shalache, which I would have started with, but I felt it kind of made my talk redundant. She says, "First and foremost, digital technology should be a beacon, pointing us towards collections in the same way landscape paintings point us towards outdoor air and light. The purpose for digital collections is twofold. They should give us the desire to see more out there in the world, or they should tide us over if the out there is yet beyond our reach." And I think this is a wonderful summary of the possibilities of using the digital for medical museums, and it's worth keeping in mind as you visit the Making Medicine Modern exhibition. So on that, thank you for your time and attention this evening. Thank you to the Dietrich team, and I'm really happy to take questions.
I'm Jim Young, the guy he referred to earlier. But I have a comment that I think is important because we look at this from two different dimensions. I come to it as a physician, an educator. I'm the dean of the medical school, the one across the street. And we're in the midst of building a massive health education campus. And in that building, we've got a lot of designs that we've intentionally created to try to move pedagogy with respect to healthcare education in a totally different direction. We've done a couple of radical things. A lot of people are very unhappy about it. We've banned any bodies without a heartbeat in the building. There will be no cadaver anatomic education in the building. We have banned, for the most part, books in the building. There's not going to be a formal library like we know it in most medical schools today. Heavily reliance on electronically available sources. And this project really was keyed to create another tool, because it's my own belief that we don't have great tools today to teach healthcare and to teach medicine per se. So as I look back at it, you come to it from a little bit different perspective. An historic picture, a museum-based orientation, a mutter, a welcome to many museums that are around the Hunterian, one of my favorites. And you alluded to the fact that people come to those exhibits for different reasons, including one of prurient behavior, as evidenced by the pictures that you showed. And the book that Jim has created so nicely with the postcards in the cadaver education suites of a variety of medical schools is an example of that. But for me, the entire purpose of these sorts of things is slightly different. Again, as a tool to teach concepts. For example, a concept that we don't discuss very much is paradigm shift. How medicine becomes modern, how medicine moves forward. One of the prized possessions in the collection here is Lister's carbolic spray machine used in the operating room, which I think Dudley Allen picked up in 1882 on a trip over to London. And was exactly 1 year after the death of our 20th President of the United States, Garfield, who was caught in a paradigm shift. You know, Lister was cruising around in 1876, and everybody threw him out because nobody believed in what he was doing. We see the same thing today with so many other aspects of healthcare and the battles that go on. And I think these kinds of tools can be extremely important when used in a pedagogical kind of fashion, as opposed in an experiential or a museum type of fashion. I'm not saying museums are not fun, they're not entertaining. I think my wife didn't quite enjoy the mutter the last time we were in there. But I think where we have to go is take these concepts and get a little bit away from the static, museum-oriented nature of them, and provide them as tools for us to be able to teach more efficiently, more rapidly, and get students to understand content better and why we were heading in the direction that we are. So I enjoyed tremendously your presentation, but my view comes just a little bit from a different perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comments. There's lots of fascinating insights there. And yes, I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm always going to argue for the value of understanding the practice of medicine in its cultural and specific time and place. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack in what you've said. I mean, I think the shift from cadaver-based anatomy is fascinating, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
At the New York Academy of Medicine, you have artifacts, not a museum per se, an interesting collection, but it's not on display to the public. And you have rare books, which are typically not on display a whole lot. Are you going to be using digital technology to share them with a larger audience, and how that might be embodied? So.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things that's been happening in libraries is thinking in, if you like, a more museum-like way. What I mean by that is, I mean, again, traditionally we think a library has two-dimensional materials, though in fact, of course, books are objects themselves, and particularly older books have a material presence and history that is important to acknowledge. I think a lot gets lost when you're only using PDFs, but it'd be interesting to see how that plays out with generations who are mostly engaging with texts that way. But a library is traditionally somewhere you come with a question in mind, and the librarians help you answer that question, whereas a museum tells you a story and interprets its collections for you. So I think we're one of the many historical libraries that is trying to think more in that way. So we're doing what I like to call thoughtful minimalist digitization. Some of you may be aware of the Medical Heritage Library and the Biodiversity Heritage Library. Both are consortia that aim to make sure that we're all not digitizing the same book 12 times, and that you're creating an experience for the user who can go in and see a digital facsimile of a book, and it doesn't matter to you where it came from, or that this volume came from the New York Academy of Medicine and the next volume came from the Countway, because it's seamless for you. But should you want to see the physical object, you can trace it back and consult it in person. So we're exploring ideas of, what would a museum look like in our building. We've created a digital collection site, Islandora, in which we try and put content up that is usually not mass digitization, but themed as more. We have a real distinction. Things like the projects with Medical Heritage Library are much more massive scale, and they're for a scholarly audience, or not even scholarly, someone who wants to read the text. So for that audience, you need to, you digitize the whole thing. Whereas for what I call the more museum-y audience, you might only digitize the images of a particular book and provide your own interpretive framework for that to make it more accessible.
I accept all those, and I share an insight that is common nature to you and me, is that in a way the digital copies of these things give a rationale or a meaning or a reason to keep the original material, because the digital version is so bad that it can't be reproduced in a way that has a sufficient resolution to be used in any other means other than that online presence. And so our own rare book collection gets heavily used, plundered for images for our exhibits, but we can't use the online version because the resolution level is so poor. So we're happy to have the original and retain it for that reason.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, what I like, and I think the Brought to Life is a great example. Digitization is brilliant for access. It's terrible for preservation. I think for the scientific research as well, there's a real danger that people are not keeping their data in a form that's necessarily going to be accessible in 10 years, let alone 100, whereas books as a technology are actually pretty robust. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think now, though, with better quality scans, if you're thinking about why you're digitizing it, particularly with medieval and early modern books, there's some really fascinating work being done in which if you can scan something to a scale where you can zoom down and look at the fibres with which the paper was created. So suddenly that book as object is interesting to a whole different set of disciplinary scholars who can extract completely different information. So I think it goes both ways.
Well, if at this present time there are no further questions on the floor here, would any more? Oh, good.
I'm curious. You mentioned the problems with putting images, particularly of human remains, online. But what do you do about that? I mean, how do you try and either prevent people, like the Huntarian says no photographs and you're not allowed to take any pictures of specimens. But how do you actually have that be enforced?
Oh, you can't.
So, okay.
I showed a medical curator that montage, and you could see the blood drained from her face. She was like, well, how do we stop this? And I said, you don't. The only thing you can do is choose to not allow photography in your collections, choose not to digitize certain things, and then enforce that very, very strictly. Or listen to other voices. I mean, particularly around human remains, what counts as sensitive is very, very different depending on your culture. I was involved in an exhibition where the Science Museum held a preserved Maori skull with very, very impressive tattooing. And this art curator wanted to use it in a show. I said, no way, because you do not want a bunch of Maori politicians and activists on your door, which was, I knew, not the reason I didn't want to do it, but I knew that would work as an argument for her. So they ended up using the death mask, showing a plaster death mask showing that same tattooing, which, as far as the British curators involved were concerned, solved the problem. The Maori people who saw it felt completely differently. So there's really interesting clashes of kind of local belief systems, the universality of science, the universality of museums that get played into this. But the quick answer to your question is, you can't. You just need to know that you can't before choosing to put anything out there.
I was listening to your talk, and I was coming from a slightly different perspective as both an electrical engineer and a member of a local school board. And one of the things with the power of digitization, the power of computers in general, is the overwhelming desire to make that the be-all, end-all tool to solve all of your problems. It's an easy conclusion to come to. And it leads to some level of complacency and some level of you're not using it in a discerning way when in essence a computer is nothing more than a tool. And I think your talk has sort of illustrated that. So I wonder if one of your roles as a curator of a museum might be to create an exhibit that contrasted why you might use digitization in some ways and then use older methods, if you will, or more tangible methods, and actually give very credible evidence for why this isn't the tool to use in all situations.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there are a lot of museums are starting to think that way. Back to the science, the center in Berlin, thinking, making a digital interactive something that you can only use if you engage with it physically using your body, or making an interactive that's not digital. One of the Welcome's Reading Room interactives is they have a little post box, and if you write a postcard from the reading room, they'll post it to you for free. Like I said, far too much money. But, people like using their bodies, people in terms of, ways, and I think there are ways that you can actually think about that and try and create that kind of moment where you move between the technologies but think about the fact, or are made aware that you're moving between the technologies. Thank you so much.